About a third of the civilian population experiences chronic sleep restriction. But in the armed forces, severe sleep deprivation is a foundational operational requirement. Up to 76% of service members routinely sleep fewer than 7 hours a night. In combat deployments, round-the-clock vigilance forces the warfighter to operate in a state of massive sleep debt. To understand exactly what the absence of rest does to a living body, we have to look back to the origins of sleep science. In 1894, Russian physician Marie de Manicine, followed by Italian physiologist Lamberto Dati in 1898, forced canine subjects into a state of continuous locomotion to see what happens when the biological drive to sleep is completely denied. The animals died within 9 to 17 days, and the cause of death had nothing to do with starvation or physical exhaustion. Post-mortem examinations revealed severe degenerative lesions, concentrated almost entirely inside the brain architecture. Dati hypothesized that during prolonged insomnia, the brain undergoes a state of autointoxication. Without sleep, the brain essentially poisons itself. These late 19th century experiments proved that sleep is a non-negotiable biological imperative. The next century of military history would be defined by a series of high-stakes attempts to bypass this specific physiological hard limit. Following World War II, the geopolitical anxieties of the Cold War triggered a covert arms race in behavioral modification. The United States military and the CIA realized that if extreme sleep loss induces cognitive collapse, that physiological vulnerability could be weaponized. They launched a series of clandestine research initiatives to extract information from detainees. What began as a Navy program called Project CHATTER in 1947 eventually consolidated into a massive, highly classified CIA operation in 1953, Project MKUltra. Among the most extreme applications were the Montreal experiments, directed by psychiatrist Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron. He sought to entirely erase a patient's identity through a methodology called Depatterning. This process utilized massive doses of electroconvulsive therapy and chemically induced extreme sleep deprivation to break the mind down to a state of profound vulnerability. Once broken, Cameron used a technique known as psychic driving. He forced these heavily drugged, deeply exhausted patients to listen to continuous audio loops of specific messages. Speakers were sometimes installed directly inside the patient's pillow, broadcasting the same phrase up to 500,000 times. These unethical experiments proved that forced wakefulness reliably causes acute paranoia, hallucinations, and the total dissolution of the human psyche. The subject becomes entirely compliant, but the exact mechanisms that break their will to resist also obliterate their capacity to accurately retrieve memories. The resulting intelligence is inherently flawed and cognitively useless. It took decades for modern neurobiology to catch up, but 21st century science has unequivocally validated Lamberto Dati's 1898 theory of autointoxication. This animated cross-section shows the glymphatic system. It is the brain's macroscopic waste clearance mechanism. It utilizes a perivascular network to pump cerebrospinal fluid through brain tissue, physically washing away the toxic metabolic waste products that naturally accumulate while you are awake. The vulnerability of this mechanism is that it operates almost exclusively during deep, slow-wave sleep. When a service member is deprived of rest, the fluid stops pumping. The toxic cellular waste accumulates, resulting in the deep neurological haze of prolonged wakefulness. This accumulation targets your executive function and complex neurocognitive processing. It severely degrades what military researchers call throughput, the mathematical product of speed and accuracy. In a combat simulation, an exhausted brain will attempt to preserve accuracy, but at the profound expense of speed. The soldier simply cannot process novel threats fast enough to execute the physical action. This mechanical failure of physiological plumbing is the primary vulnerability for soldiers engaged in multi-domain operations. Because sleep loss in combat is unavoidable, the military had to pivot from trying to weaponize exhaustion offensively to fighting desperately to preserve their own forces from it. Historically, the military relied on brute force chemical stimulants like amphetamines to override the biological demand for sleep, which carried severe cardiovascular and addiction risks. Today, they utilize safer wakefulness-promoting agents like modafinil, which maintain situational awareness with a substantially lower potential for abuse. This chart demonstrates 2Be Alert, a predictive algorithmic tool developed by the Department of Defense. Schedulers input a unit's sleep history and shift work. The algorithm predicts when cognitive performance will crash and outputs an automated caffeine dosing schedule to rescue alertness precisely when required. But predicting fatigue doesn't clear the toxic waste from the brain. To address that, DARPA initiated the Restore program. Using timed auditory and thermal stimuli, engineers can artificially evoke and amplify the brain's slow waves. This tricks the glymphatic system into accelerating its clearance process, allowing a warfighter to achieve the biological recuperation of a full night's rest within a highly compressed 3-hour combat nap. Modern interventions like 2Be Alert and Restore integrate biological recovery directly into the unit's logistics. By treating sleep as a calculable variable, the military attempts to engineer the warfighter's neurobiology with the same precision applied to their hardware. The military's relationship with medical ethics is complicated. The overriding doctrine of operational necessity has historically shielded the government from liability, allowing researchers to subject troops to severe biological risks in the name of gathering data and preserving the fighting force. While algorithmic and pharmaceutical countermeasures focus on the acute mitigation of fatigue, the Millennium Cohort Study, tracking hundreds of thousands of U.S. military personnel over decades, documents a devastating long-term reality. Personnel deployed to combat zones develop chronic sleep disorders at exponentially higher rates than the civilian population. This chronic sleep restriction acts as a catalyst for severe psychiatric morbidity. Because the exhausted brain fails to clear neurotoxins, neural tissue is left highly vulnerable to the inflammatory cascades initiated by blast exposure, directly worsening traumatic brain injury outcomes. Simultaneously, the lack of restorative sleep prevents the neurological desensitization of traumatic memories, locking the veteran's neurocircuitry in a state of hyperarousal and heavily contributing to PTSD. The impact is so severe that the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research is currently executing a massive study, concluding in 2025, to determine if the neurobiological damage of consistently getting 5 or fewer hours of sleep persists even after a normal sleep schedule is restored. The military has mapped the neurobiology of fatigue and engineered advanced countermeasures to fight it, but their single greatest hurdle remains entirely cultural. Overcoming the institutional bravado that normalizes massive sleep restriction is the only way to protect the long-term health of the veteran population. You can engineer temporary alertness, but human biology rarely forgives a chronic debt.